New York, NYPD lose public trust for aggressive protest responses. New York. The NYPD's aggressive response to protests that swept the city after the death of George Floyd heightened tensions and undermined public trust in the ability of the police to protect the rights of citizens, a probe by the Department of Investigation has found. NYPD officers used excessive enforcement against protesters, including kettling, or hemming in a group of demonstrators, mass arrests, and employing batons and pepper spray, investigators wrote in a report released Friday morning. The NYPD's mishandling of the protests was not confined to misdeeds by individual officers, some of whom took actions that were at a minimum, unprofessional and, at worst, unjustified excessive force or abuse of authority, the report finds. The problems went beyond poor judgment or misconduct by some individual officers, DOI Commissioner Margaret Garnett told reporters Friday. The NYPD as an institution made a number of key errors or omissions that likely escalated tensions and the potential for violence. And certainly contributed to a public perception that the department was suppressing rather than facilitating lawful First Amendment assembly and expression their views. The police department was caught unprepared for the massive protests, the probe concluded, and initially deployed too few police officers before flooding the streets with more cops. Top brass acknowledged they were surprised by the scope of the demonstrations. Some protests turned chaotic in the early days, and widespread looting took place on a few nights in Manhattan and the Bronx. But police were criticized for both failing to stop the looting and using excessive force against peaceful protesters. These deployment strategies, tactics, and shows of force exacerbated confrontations between police and protesters, rather than de-escalating tensions, DOI wrote, adding that the insufficient number of officers in the early days contributed to overwhelmed and exhausted frontline police officers, creating conditions that increased the likelihood of poor judgment, unprofessional behavior, and unjustified use of force. The NYPD was also selective in its enforcement of an 8 p.m. curfew imposed by Mayor Bill de Blasio after nights of chaos, sometimes allowing protesters to remain on the street and other times arresting them en masse. The inconsistent application of the curfew similarly generated legitimate public concerns about selective enforcement, DOI wrote in the 111-page report. NYPD use of force and crowd control tactics often failed to discriminate between lawful, peaceful protesters and unlawful actors, and contributed to the perception that officers were exercising force in some cases beyond what was necessary under the circumstances. Most of the officers deployed had not received recent training in policing protesting, according to the investigation, for many, not since they graduated from the police academy. While the NYPD ordered additional training after the Floyd protests, DOI said it is too focused on disorder control tactics and does not focus enough on de-escalation. They also found that the NYPD relied too much on intelligence, such as at a Mott Haven protest where the department had intel that violence was planned, but no violence by protesters actually took place. Nonetheless, cops made forceful mass arrests, which DOI dubbed a disproportionate response. The investigations department recommended stronger outside oversight of the NYPD, combining existing police oversight functions into a single agency headed by an independent board. They also call for a host of changes to the NYPD's handling of protests, including creating a new protest response unit, publishing a patrol guide policy on protest policing that outlines demonstrators' First Amendment rights, reducing the role of the Strategic Response Group, and minimizing the use of cops in riot gear. In a 7-minute video published on Twitter, Mayor Bill de Blasio, who largely defended the police response at the time, said he agrees with the report and apologized for his handling of the protests. "It makes very clear we've got to do something different," he said. "I'm reflecting on what happened in May and June, and I look back with remorse. I wish I had done better. I want everyone to understand that. And I'm sorry I didn't do better. And I've learned a lot of valuable lessons. And I want our police department to do better. And I'm going to insist upon that." De Blasio's lengthy response so soon after the report was an anomaly and prompted criticism that he was trying to blunt the report's impact. Okay, WTF. The mayor is being allowed to spin a report that the Department of Investigation has not publicly released or made available to @NYC council members, council member and controller candidate Brad Lander said in a separate tweet. DOI is supposed to be independent, not acting in coordination the mayor's press team. It has long been standard practice for DOI to share reports in advance with their subjects, Garnett said. DOI maintained independent and final control of any fact-finding or recommendations, she added. Those facts and recommendations have been made public in the report without influence or interference from any party. Former DOI Commissioner Mark Peters, who was fired by de Blasio in 2018 after growing hostility between the two, concurred it was commonplace for city agencies to see the report ahead of publication. Where there wasn't a criminal investigation, it was standard practice for the agency involved to see the report before it was issued, he told Politico. The hope was that they would agree to the report and agree to accept the policy and procedure recommendations. Police Commissioner Dermot Shea said he had reviewed the report and planned to act on its guidance. In general terms, the report captured the difficult period that took place in May/June of 2020 and presents 20 logical and thoughtful recommendations that I intend to incorporate into our future policy and training, he said in a statement. However, top police brass in interviews with Doi said they would not have done anything differently, even with the benefit of hindsight, other than deploying more police officers in the first days of protests. Shea was among those interviewed. I don't know quite what to make of that, Garnett said. I hope that the department is more self-critical and self-reflective than those statements reflect. One key player in the protest response, then Chief of Patrol Fausto Pichardo, refused to be interviewed by Doi. He resigned in October amid tensions with de Blasio. Doi considered using a subpoena to compel him to talk, but opted not to because it would delay the investigation, officials said. The NYPD has also continued to deny it uses kettling to surround and arrest protesters, statements that Garnett said are false. The department does not use the term kettling, but refers to the same tactic as encirclement. Despite his apology, de Blasio said there were no plans for a shake-up in police leadership. We're definitely going to look at actions of individual commanders down to the precinct level, but I think it's fair to say that what's being pointed out here is not so much time for retribution, honestly, but time for change, he said at a press briefing Friday. This is not to me about someone should be fired. This is about we all have to learn from it, we all have to embrace the changes. If there's anyone in leadership in the NYPD who does not accept these changes, then they shouldn't be in leadership. The NYPD faced similar investigations after 2004 protests around the Republican National Convention and Occupy Wall Street in 2011 and made similar pledges of reform. It is déjà vu all over again in some ways, Garnett said. A lot of the learning from those earlier events seems to have fallen by the wayside. Police Benevolent Association President Pat Lynch said the report confirms what police officers knew on the first night of riots: our city leaders sent us out with no plan, no strategy, and no support to deal with unrest. The police response to the protests has sparked multiple lawsuits, including a federal civil rights suit by the NCLU and Legal Aid Society on behalf of protesters who say they were brutalized. Mayor de Blasio's mea culpa comes a day late and a dollar short. It should not have required a city investigation for him to reach the same conclusion as millions with eyes to see bore witness to this past summer, the groups said in a joint statement.